Attending this is really to demonstrate that we have a vested interest as an organization in terms of the post-Cotonou discussions. The Pacific was considered one of those partners that was going to roll over and pretty quickly roll over to the Europeans in the IPA negotiations. Why? You look at our region, we are absolutely tiny. Our population is less than 10 million people. Our land areas is absolutely small. And I was reminded by the European French ambassador that the value of Pacific market in Europe is, get this, it's less than 1% of world global trade. In fact, it's less than 0.5%. And it sits somewhere between 0.001% of global trade in Europe. But that's quite significant when they really emphasize that your market value in terms of that share of European market is massive, but you only occupy a small space. It's really to keep you at that small space. So, and our commodities entering the European market were highly limited. I mean, sugar for Fiji, fisheries, and I want to talk about fisheries as something that we could, as the region, we can offer ACP to really look at and to pick up on some of the earlier conversations around strategies, around understanding your development. I think that's very important. Coffee, vanilla, and kava. Very limited commodities into the European market. We were very naive when we entered. We entered negotiations in 2004. We came with the specific naiveness. We're nice, we're small, we're friendly people, we like protocols and niceties. The one lesson that we took from the EPAs is that it really ripped, and I use the word ripped, any illusions around notions of partnership pretty quickly. Our negotiators were horrified at being treated. The manner in which they were treated by the Europeans was quite significant, and I think that's important. It really, for me, is really important that we are not moving into the next phase constantly naive as Pacific Islanders in that relationship. And it opened up opportunities for us in terms of process to engage with negotiators once that illusion was ripped off, the veil was ripped off. It made it a little bit easier to work with our negotiators who had the tendencies to keep us out. So we have the very similar experiences as the Caribbean and Africa in terms of being kept on the periphery, constantly being limited that way. Understanding the tricks of negotiations from other regions were also quite necessary in the Pacific. But there's some good things about the Pacific. Our smallness means that the negotiators are never too far from us. In fact, you could be personally related to the Prime Minister, the Minister, any lead negotiator. That smallness works to our advantage, that we intend and have always exploited because of that smallness. It just means that I could just so happen to sit on the same flight as the lead negotiator from the Solomon Islands, who just so happens to be the minister. This smallness meant that we could begin the processes of building trust between the lead negotiators, the leadership, political leadership, and civil society, which we did. And I think that's one of the key lessons, is that we used everything and the smallness to our advantage in terms of negotiation. We were able to bridge and build the kinds of trust that's necessary. Leaks became quite phenomenal. So, we would have jokes about the truck that kind of just dropped everything. So ability to access technical, legal text became high priority, because otherwise we'd be accused of just simply screaming from the outside, not understanding what was contained in the legal text. But that meant that we had to bridge and build a kind of relationship with the technocrats. And it was an uneasy relationship. This whole question of mandates is, for me, quite problematic, because mandates was used against civil society in terms of our intervention to disrupt process. So governments would say, where do you get your mandate from? So we simply took mandates where we could and from where we stood, because it was necessary to be at the table. Today, only 2 countries have ratified interim EPAs, which is PNG and Fiji, and that's quite testament to the original notions that we would simply roll over and sign everything and open up all of our markets. But I wanted to talk about what collapsed negotiations into spectacular ways that we had not anticipated, to the point where the Europeans is now accusing the Pacific of being inflexible. And I want to use fish as the case study, and I think that's what the Pacific can offer African and Caribbean negotiators. And I think it goes back to the fundamental questions that was raised this morning, is knowing what you want, your development visions. We have a very strong development vision associated with fish. The Pacific is home to 70% of tuna. It comes from migratory species that goes through our EEZ, and we control it like a cartel. That was the vision of our development leaders from the 1970s. Way before UNCLOS came into play, our leaders were very clear that these migratory species that came through our EEZs was going to be in our control and our dominion. Those decisions they took out in the 1970s have come into an advantage that we are leveraging at this particular point, much to the annoyance of all the major distant fishing water nations, of which the Europeans have such a vested interest in terms of this particular resource. We have done very sophisticated ways of managing this resource. We've set the rules under which any distant fishing water, if you want access to that resource, you have to abide by the rules that we set in the Pacific. Now, this was quite contentious within civil society sector. And I remember in the initial days of EPA, a lot of our partners, particularly from the conservation sector, they were not supportive of the kinds of decisions that the Pacific took and which we as civil society in the Pacific supported, which is to control this particular resource. Our leaders were very clear that our rules would not be subsumed or subservient to the European rules around fisheries. So the notions of conservation measures, we would not recognize European conservation measures. If you intend to fish in our waters, you will operate by the rules and the conservation measures that our countries take. The Europeans were very clear about what they wanted. They were using things like IUU conservation measures, but at the heart of fisheries, it was all about access. That was what they were after, and that was what our negotiators were unwilling to do. And so for fisheries, their entry in terms of the mechanism was a little bit late, but they created a new structure so that you couldn't talk about fish without consulting fisheries ministers and technocrats before the trade negotiators could negotiate in terms of, if we gave up on this chapter, what would it implicate in terms of fisheries? Fisheries took absolute control of that particular commodity. On the back of fisheries, the Pacific was able to look at other commodities to practice these kinds of control over your resources, cover, for instance. And I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to flag it, that it's not just lost cause, lost hope, that I think we can, if we're very particular about our strategic choices. We did a couple of really good things, and I think we had, we recognized that it was funded, negotiations were funded by the Europeans, but we had a couple of good things working for us. And one was that we had good lead technical negotiators, which the Europeans worked really hard. So in 2007, we were probably one of the regions that negotiated with Europe without a lead technical advisor. Why? Because the Europeans insisted that he remain on the outside when our leaders went in. We were one of those regions. But I think the message here is that Europe recognized some of the key things that the Pacific did, and they worked really hard to pretty much attack that mechanism and infrastructure.